When you picture the very top of our world, what do you see? Probably just a vast frozen wilderness, right? But what if the oldest stories humanity has? What if they told of something completely different? Today, we're diving into the myth of Hyperborea, a legendary lost paradise that was supposedly right there at the North Pole.
And that really brings us to the core question here. What if all that ice and snow we see today is just covering up the ruins of a forgotten world? What if the top of the world was once a warm, green, thriving heartland? For the ancient Greeks, this wasn't just some wild idea. They talked about a real place called Hyperborea, a land beyond the north wind. And in their telling, it was the total opposite of the Arctic we know. It was a paradise where the sun shone for half the years straight, and people lived for 1,000 years in perfect health. All right, so let's dig into the myth itself first. What exactly did these ancient storytellers claim was hiding at the northernmost edge of their world? Well, the legends paint this picture of a perfect utopian society. It was so perfect that Apollo himself, the god of light, was said to go there every winter to hang out. The people, the Hyperboreans, they didn't know sickness, they didn't know war, they lived for centuries. And get this, when they finally got tired of life, they didn't just fade away. No, they would put on flower crowns and take a final, joyful leap from a sacred cliff into the sea. Now, for centuries, people just wrote this off as a beautiful story, just a myth. But that all started to change when researchers began looking at some very old and very, very strange maps. And this is our first clue that maybe, just maybe, Hyperborea was something more. Take a look at this. On the left, that's our modern view of the Arctic. It's all ice and ocean. But on the right, from the famous Mercator map of 1595, we see something that should be completely impossible. It shows 4 huge islands surrounding an open sea, with a massive mountain sitting right at the pole. And this was drawn centuries before anyone could have possibly gone there to see it. And that's the big question, isn't it? Incredibly, modern ground-penetrating radar has actually confirmed that there are geological features under all that ice that look a lot like what's on these old maps. So, how could they have known? The hunt for an answer to that leads us to our next clue, and to a really radical scientific theory. So our second clue doesn't come from ancient myths at all. It comes from a pretty controversial geological theory that, well, it might just explain how a paradise could have ever existed at the North Pole in the first place. The theory is called crustal displacement, and the basic idea is that the Earth's entire outer shell, the crust, isn't totally fixed. The theory goes that it can actually slide or shift all in one piece, and in the process, it could rapidly drag whole continents into completely different climate zones. So a landmass that's at the pole today could have once been in a much warmer, more temperate latitude. It's really a 3-step process. First, something triggers a sudden shift in the planet's crust. Second, the continents get dragged to new positions on the globe. And third, because of that, climates don't change over millions of years. They change almost instantly. A green paradise could become a frozen wasteland, well, practically overnight. Now, I'll be honest, the theory is still pretty controversial, but it was compelling enough that even Albert Einstein was intrigued by it. And maybe more importantly, it gives us a potential explanation for one of nature's greatest mysteries, the flash-frozen mammoths they find in Siberia. These animals are found with undigested temperate flowers and grasses still in their stomachs, as if they were literally frozen in the middle of a meal. But what in the world could trigger an event that catastrophic? Something that could shift the entire crust of the planet. Well, the evidence seems to be pointing to something from way beyond our world, a cosmic cataclysm that changed the face of the Earth in an instant. And scientists have actually pinpointed a specific moment in our planet's history when everything changed, about 12,800 years ago. This moment is known as the Younger Dryas Impact. The theory is that a huge piece of a comet exploded over the northern ice sheets. The incredible heat vaporized miles of ice in an instant, triggering floods on a scale we can't even imagine. But right after that, all the dust and ash thrown into the atmosphere plunged the planet into a deep freeze that lasted for over 1,000 years, burying the entire northern world under ice. And we know something big happened because this impact left behind what scientists call a cosmic fingerprint. All across the northern hemisphere, there's this thin, consistent layer in the soil. And in that layer, you find high levels of platinum and these things called nanodiamonds, the unmistakable chemical signature of something from space hitting us. So, if a civilization like Hyperborea ever did exist in the far north, this would have been the end. A world-ending cataclysm that buried their entire world under miles of ice and permafrost, basically erasing it from history. But was it erased completely? This brings us right back to where we started. If a world like that existed and was destroyed in such a violent way, what would be left behind? What kind of echoes would we hear today? What if the myths of Hyperborea are those echoes? What if they're the broken, fragmented memories of a real event told by traumatized survivors huddled around campfires? Passed down for hundreds of generations, the details would blur, the facts would get twisted, and eventually, a true story, a piece of history, would start to sound just like a myth. And that presents a really profound idea, that maybe we aren't just the descendants of simple cave dwellers. Maybe we're all part of an unbroken chain of survivors from a much more advanced civilization that was just wiped off the face of the earth by a cosmic disaster. And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. It really forces us to look at our own past differently and to ask ourselves, are all those fantastic myths from antiquity just stories? Or could they be humanity's oldest and maybe its most tragic memories?